Hi, everyone, and welcome back to That UFO podcast. Joining me for a review show looking at James Fox's latest directorial effort, The Programme. I've got Dan once again. Dan, hello.
Hello, thank you for having me on the program to talk about the program.
Yes, it was programmed well, wasn't it? We're recording this just after the members only content that released. So if you went back and listened to that, and we were talking about Darcy Weir's Cosmic Con, very different documentary, Dan,
Yeah.
to this effort from James Fox. I think it's fair to say this documentary, The Programme, which is the direct follow-on from The Phenomenon that came out a couple of years ago, has been long awaited. I think it's landed at an incredibly good time, probably for James as well. Not so much from the hearings that happened a few weeks ago, but probably because of the drone UAP object flaps that are going on right now in the US and the UK. I
Yeah.
think this will land really well with the public who maybe have an interest in UFOs at a time of year we're probably not expecting it. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, where else is it? Is Germany? We've heard Oregon. Like I've seen some people posting some pictures from California. So yeah, I imagine people are going to be searching for UFO on Google quite a lot. So
Yeah.
hopefully, after the turbulent journey James had with his previous movie and the rights and so on and so forth, hopefully this one does well for him.
Yeah, and I've released the kind of 10-minute preview at the start of the interview. People are going to be hearing this, Dan, after the program's come out. But I put out the preview of the episode to kind of help try and get any more pre-orders over the line for James, to be honest, because like you say, he got completely shafted by the previous distribution companies out of almost any money from Moment of Contact and The Phenomenon. And that made up the first kind of 10 minutes when I spoke to James. So people can kind of hear that. And off the back of that, hopefully, and it has actually a few listeners have been in touch to say, I wasn't sure, but hearing what he went through and the efforts just to get this made, it did like almost bankrupt him, folks, and he's still paying back money from it now. So
Did he get the rights back?
to those two, I don't know.
I hope so.
That's a good question. I'll have to ask him. Yeah, good shout. Why did I not ask him that? Ask them other stuff. Go check out that interview, folks. But yeah, I'll follow up with that. Oh, do you know what? While we do this, Dan, what were your thoughts before the program came out? Then, what were you expecting from it? What were you hoping it was going to be?
So I literally, my first notes on the page before I press play, I was like, okay, what are my expectations of this? And I pretty much just expected an update of events in Congress and things like that since the end of the phenomenon, and maybe a new whistleblower or two.
Okay, that's fair. And in the build up, we had the Jason Sands situation came out, didn't it? This was the fact for folks unaware, many of you will be, but some of you won't be maybe. Jason Sands was a whistleblower who came forward online and social media a few months ago now on an X or Twitter space, talking about being a whistleblower, being involved in a program, encountering a being, and it went from the sublime to the sensational. It was kind of what you would think in a sensational whistleblower type story that involved an entity, and it really split the opinion, didn't it? That actually, if this guy is going to be in James Fox's documentary, should James include him? Is it too much? Is the guy lying? It sounds ridiculous. It sounds incredible. It was all those superlatives were thrown at it. And he is in there, spoiler alert, folks, and this will discuss the documentary. So if you don't want it spoiled, don't listen yet. But this might help you go away to actually deciding whether or not to watch it or not, depending on what we say potentially for some of you. So, how did you feel about Jason Sands potentially being in there or not?
I was one of those that thought that it would, after listening to the Twitter space, it was like a 3-hour thing where, yeah, as you said, like the claims run the gamut of the kind of things we hear, like, yes, I've seen evidence of anomalous craft, all the way up to stories about beings and seeing like these weird craft and so on and so forth. And it also brought in a lot of stuff where people were asking Jason about the 20 and back program and Solar Warden, which is kind of Corey Good. This is where people will hear the crossover with
Yeah.
that thing we recorded. yeah, the Corey Good stuff, and everyone just threw so many questions at Jason. Bless him. I can see why he did the space, because he just wanted an open kind of forum to be asked everything. But at the same time, it did kind of get a lot of people, I think, including myself, thinking that it would damage the reputation of this film if Jason was included in it.
I think there was an element of it. It seemed to mix. I think Jason himself said this afterwards. He ended up mixing experience and what he's seeing truly happened with speculation and opinion,
Yes.
and all of that kind of bled into each other. Which I don't necessarily blame him for, because I think that's happened with a lot of folks in the UFO topic over the years. But let's get to the programme. Directed by James Fox, written by James Fox and Lance Mungia, and narrated by Peter Coyote. We get an introduction with some big name players. James Brennan's quote, where, form of, like, have you got the exact quote written down, Dan? I'm guessing you do.
I don't actually, but the
Yeah.
quote was something along the lines of that it could be a form of life that we don't quite understand yet.
Yeah, that whole what is life stuff. Hal Puthoff, who is a big name. Where would you put Hal Puthoff if there was like a top 10 names of folks involved in the UFO topic who know the most, one being the most? Where would you put Puthoff in that table?
Hal has always been like he seems really informed, and before this, he seems someone that knows a lot more than he can say. So I would put Hal in probably the top 5 in the top 10. I wouldn't be able to place him, it's like changes every day, like if someone asked you your favorite movie.
Yeah.
But I've said before, like I think Hal should be called to testify in the congressional hearings, because he just seems to know a lot more than he's willing to say publicly.
I think that's the issue, is Hal is one of those guys who potentially publicly could disappoint a lot of folks, because what he could say of real interest would be in the background. I don't know. But yeah, I think he's someone they should be, or at least wanting to speak to anyway. I'd put him in top 5, potentially top 3, just depending. In the introduction, we hear the narrator tell us that Congress in the last few years has begun to learn about the UEP topic, the cover-up and the black budget programs. I asked James Fox this question, Dan. I'm going to ask you. Do you think that's something that we, the public, have to remember and be aware of when we get frustrated with any individual, whether it's the UEP caucus, whether it's all of the Republicans and Democrats and congressmen and women, senators, who are getting involved in this conversation in any way, as they still have a limited knowledge, or are still learning who to listen to, who not to listen to. They're hearing all this stuff. I mean, you might have, for example, Nancy Mace going home at night and watching a Stephen Greer documentary to try and catch up, because who are they listening to? It sounds like they're listening to a lot of folks. So is it the case we should really be giving them some slack?
I think so. When people come into the subject, you see it on social media. Loads of people give these dossiers of information to the Senate staffers to kind of pass on. And they all contain different things depending on what you believe is reputable in the subject. And each of us has our own set of beliefs in that. There's kind of a core crossover generally, in a broad stroke way. But
like TR3B, Orbs,
TR3B, David Adair,
stuff,
Pleiadians. Yeah. So when, we're watching the hearings and someone starts asking about hybrids, you've got to remember that maybe they've seen a documentary where there's a lot of talk about hybrids, because there are a lot of documentaries about hybrids. So yeah, I think some slack should be cut, especially when someone's in it for the first time. If someone's in a hearing 2 years ago and they're still asking the basic questions now, I think that's a bit sus. But if they're new to the subject completely, then yeah, you got to expect like basic level questions and maybe some mistakes.
Kirk McConnell is on camera here, and he's a pretty big name. He is someone who gets brought up semi-often in the UFO conversation by other big name players. He researched the UEP topic as part of his ongoing duties and whatnot from 2017 to 2024. Have you got any detail there, Dan, on Kirk McConnell and who exactly he is in the background and what his roles were?
So he was on a lot of these committees that we've heard for several years now. These committees have been receiving witnesses that supposedly have firsthand knowledge of these programs. They've been going in and testifying in a classified setting where they could kind of talk openly. And Kirk McConnell was one of these guys who got to sit there and listen to all of these people come forward.
Mm-hmm.
So he was also recently on stage at the SALT conference. That was kind of his debut into this subject now. And I was surprised to see him speaking out. And I love the fact that he's in this movie, because you've got to remember, he's heard all of these people that we're all chomping at the bit to listen to hear their testimony. Kirk has heard these people speak. I say Kirk, Representative McConnell, I should say. He's heard these people speak. And yet he's still here in this documentary, not saying, oh, there's nothing to it, we didn't find anything. He's here attesting that there are events picked up by the Aegis top-of-the-line radar systems of objects dropping down seemingly from space, flying around, and going right back up. And he calls them something radically different. I like how conservative he was, not too sensational, but it's clearly gotten under his skin in a way that he probably didn't expect before he started interviewing those whistleblowers.
Yeah, so what's really important for me is when folks are looking at this going, I've been asked quite often, is there anything new in this? Here's something new. Here's a guy who we've heard mentioned who isn't very public about the UFO, UAP topic, who I think might well get a place in that league table, Dan, I asked you about, where if Putov's quite high up and a Jay Stratton is quite high up and maybe a General McCausland, those kind of names who are rumoured to be involved in this, he's probably lower down than those guys, I think. I don't know, it's literally we're having to guess, aren't we? But he is a guy who probably knows a lot of stuff we would like to know. So here's something new straight off the bat. When you've got Putov and McConnell in the first minutes of this documentary sharing their thoughts, opinions. He even talks about here high altitude systems picking these things up, coming from space, coming down, returning back into orbit. Really interesting stuff. And I'm really keen to find out more. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, to find out anything about the tracking of these objects going back to where they come from. Because like when we talk about any UFO video being filmed, to even use the drone UAP flap, and we have to keep saying drone UAP flap right now, okay? It's very reactive when you see one of these. It's if you find a video of someone filming the sky and a UFO turns up, instant red flag. Is that fair enough for you, Dan? Yeah. It's like, wait a minute, you just happened to be filming and a UFO came by?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the video starts and the UFO should be there. However, you should be able to then keep filming it until it leaves, just the way things work. So if you're then a big organization, military complex, and you have sensor systems and tracking systems, it might be that you're reacting to the object arriving, let's say a Tic Tac, but you must then have so many different sensor systems and satellites trying to lock on and follow these objects in whatever way they can back to where they are coming from. And that's what interests me is, okay, so, and that must be really high level. That's really sensitive and classified. Are they going underwater somewhere? Is there a particular volcano they go back into? Is there somewhere off in space they go to? And then how far can we follow them out into space? Or do they go back to a Iranian mothership off the east coast of the US, which was claimed recently? Who knows? But that kind of stuff really, really interests me, because I think you start to get really towards smoking gun UFO evidence then.
Yeah, absolutely. It suggests something different, right? Something that we can't do. And I just looked up on, quick search on Wikipedia here, but McConnell here is speaking about the Spy 1 system that was around the Nimitz encounter, the Tic Tac encounter. And Wikipedia says, known as the Shield of the Fleet, The spy-powered 6-megawatt radar is able to perform search, tracking, and missile guidance functions simultaneously with the track capacity of well over 100 targets at more than 100 nautical miles, which is 190 kilometers for listeners elsewhere in the world. So it has staggering capabilities to track these craft. And it's not something that's going to get confused if there's like 5 birds there that are kind of being picked up. This is something that can, there's a, how would you say it, like a high level of fidelity to the data that it's giving people. And there would be, a floor and a ceiling, by which I mean it can only track between like certain altitudes. So maybe like I was trying to find the floor and the ceiling there, but it would be something like 10 feet as in sea level all the way up to like 70,000-80,000 feet.
Yeah.
And then outside of that it'd be lost, but outside of that you're pretty much hitting space anyway, so we can absolutely say if something goes from the floor to the ceiling of that stupendously advanced radar tracking system, it's not something that tech made by human hands can do.
Yeah. Early on in the documentary, we get, as you expected, Dan, when you said what your hopes or your thoughts would be, we get a review and summary of the last couple of years since the phenomenon. We get those first hearings. We get the hearings with Grush coming into it. And I think it's a really nice, for anyone worried this was going to be a documentary, it's an hour and 42 minutes long. It was going to be a documentary all about those hearings. It's not. It literally summarizes those quite early. And it does dip back now and again, depending if it has to, but it brings you up to speed pretty quickly and moves on. Early on, I wonder, did you suspect we were going to see anyone appear who didn't appear?
No, but I was surprised to see one person there. I'd heard about McConnell just because he's in the trailer there, but I didn't expect Logan, as in he's a gentleman who worked for the UAPTF, who has developed a piece of technology where you can report UFO sightings, basically called Phenom. You can download that on the App Store and report there. But I was pleasantly surprised to see him there speaking so openly about the work that he has done. And it's another thing that kind of adds to the snowball. He's someone that's been in our community that hasn't been on the podcast circuit for interviews and things like that. And yet he was there in plain sight, not to Ross Coulthart, the whole time.
Hang fire, and we'll get to the whistleblower section because that fits in there definitely. It's Lenval Logan. So before that, you've got clips of James Brennan and Avril Haines talking about other forms of life, using terms like extraterrestrially. Wondering, is this a slow drip feed of the language into situations traditionally, Dan, that it hasn't been used? And I know we can look at these things. It's taking clips probably there from the last, say, 24 months of 4 or 5 people using a term or a piece of language, and you might look and go, well, it's been done 5 times in 2 years. However, now we can look back and go, big picture, they used the language. They used it in these settings. We started seeing it introduced, at least publicly, being discussed by really important people at really high levels of government. Do you think there is something to that being a slow drip feed, or is it just that's just coincidence?
Somewhere in between, I would say. Well, sorry, not even in between, because I don't think it's a coincidence. I think these people have heard this language in their classified settings and then seeing it outside. So I guess kind of a drip feed, but not an intentional one.
Yeah,
it's
okay.
just the language that they use, and just like UAP became, right? That was the internal term for it, and now everyone outside uses UAP.
They may not even know they're drip feeding the language in, but
yes,
by design or otherwise, they are. The Wilson Davis memo comes up, Dan. I was glad to see this in there because this is something that a lot of folks who are well versed in ufology will know about. But it was nice to see it there because for people who are less familiar with the topic or newer to it, I think this is a really interesting way to bring them in. Wilson Davis memo, very quickly, folks, was Admiral Thomas Wilson and physicist Eric Davis meeting in a shadowy car park in the back seat of a car, and Eric Davis talking to Wilson about Wilson trying to find stovepiped UAP crash retrieval programs and getting somewhere, but not as far as he wanted to. And Davis basically has photographic memory, went home and wrote everything down from the conversation in form of a memo, and it got leaked or released. So Wilson never really talks about this subject publicly. He says to Davis during the recollection, "I'll deny this if it ever comes out," which he quite rightly he stuck to his word. But obviously that would be huge if Thomas Wilson ever came forward in one of those hearings, Dan. If, say, Schellenberger had stepped aside on that day and said, "I'd like to introduce Thomas Wilson, author of the Immaculate Constellation Notes." I don't think he is, but if that kind of happened, and then Thomas Wilson says, "Yes, my meeting with Eric Davis was true," and that's like, wow, that's bombshell.
That would be a bombshell. Absolutely. The whole UFO subject would be on fire if someone like Admiral Wilson was to confirm that. Even, to be honest, if he was to confirm in any public way that he was at that meeting with Eric Davis, it just lends credence to everything being written down. Everything that's written down would be genuine.
Having some weight to it, at least.
There was some crazy details that were written down, to do with bodies and craft recovered, that there was a black program that had 400 to 800 workers, that was held outside of Congress with no presidential oversight, and then that phrase that they had intact craft, not made by man, not made by human hands. And that as a phrase, if Eric Davis, whether he has photographic memory or not, if someone said that phrase to me, that's a phrase that sits with you, right? It's a really nice way of putting it. And even if he was just to confirm that bit and leave everything else vague, it would be huge.
See, in the memo, there's a section where it says, if anyone wants more detail on this, there's some really great interviews done out there. Richard Dolan's got like a 4-hour breakdown of the Wilson Davis notes and everything. I had Joe Murgia, who's done a lot of research on them, on once. So loads of something people should go and dive into. It's fascinating. In the memo, it does say that they didn't know where this was from, but then in brackets it says they had some ideas on this. What do you think that means? That's pure speculation, but we don't know where these are coming from, but have some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, you'd look at the tech, you would see its capability, and from that you would derive the environments that it was made to operate in. So, for example, if you found a fighter plane, you would be able to extrapolate from the materials that it uses, from the stress that you can put on those materials, the strength of them, and so on and so forth, that it was intended for atmospheric flight. Whereas something that wasn't built in that way, that was built to operate in a vacuum, would have other telltale signs. And you'd be able to say, okay, this seems to be built as a spacecraft to operate in space, in the vacuum. And so they kind of lead you down different investigatory paths then to, like I say, ideas about where this can come from. If it's coming from space and it's space travel, then it stands to reason that it's from another planet. If it's built like a submarine, it stands to reason that it's from underwater, and it spends a lot of time in there. So yeah, you can pull details out of things even if you don't exactly know where they're from. But I'd be really curious to hear what their ideas were.
I wondered if it even goes back to partly what I mentioned before about them having some data on, we recovered a craft, but we had tracked it coming in from orbit, and we knew it was having difficulty, etc., etc. We found it crashed, so we've got an idea that's come from out there, for example. So when I spoke to James Fox, really interesting, he said someone he spoke to quite recently on the crash retrieval program stuff said to him, most of the recoveries we have are from underwater and not from land. And I thought that was quite an interesting note, that because underwater recoveries are just by nature far harder than recoveries on land.
Yeah, they are. And I mean, most of the planet's covered in water. So if you drop something from
You
space,
heard it here
and
first,
something
folks.
just crashed, it's more likely to hit an ocean than it is land.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it definite, of course. There's supposedly crashes that have happened on land. But yeah, again, you'd be able to tell, right? Like, how is this reacting to the marine environment? Are the materials rusting underwater? Does it seem like it was built for operation down here? If they found it underwater and it was pristine, that's very telling.
Slight sidebar, Dan. We've not talked about this, I don't think. Did you see the was it 4chan post or something about the underwater factory?
Yes,
Right.
making these craft.
Yeah, underwater factory. It's mobile. Governments are aware of it, and if anyone tries to approach it, it will defend itself or move and won't be seen for days. What do you think of that idea that it's like a mobile underwater factory?
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. Like if and you gotta remember, I'm not some analyst that works for Space Force or whatever. Like, I'm just riffing on
That's what you would
sci-fi
say.
kind
Yeah,
of.
go on.
Yeah, that is what
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah.
I'm just riffing on sci-fi stuff that I've kind of seen and ideas present. But I would want to, if I was going to send probes to another planet, a really good way to do that would be not to send one probe, but to send a machine that can manufacture probes, because you assume that there's going to be damage and so on and so forth on these things. So if you can replace them and replicate them and just build them when you need them, then that's a really great kind of solution. And it also means then, yeah, like I say, one gets damaged, you can just replace it. And oh crap, I forgot what I was going to say now. But it's a really compelling idea. Like, I'm not a fan of 4chan and stuff like that. Should be taken with a pinch of salt. But oh, sorry, that's what I was going to say. Something like that can use the materials present there. And that's what NASA are trying to do with our kind of moon missions, and what Elon wants to do with Mars. It's not about bundling up a bunch of bricks so you can send them to Mars and make houses. It's about finding a solution where you can send the manufacturing facility to the planet and make everything from the materials already there. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, it makes more sense. And even in human history, that's a more advanced technology than our previous stuff, where we're just sending rockets up to space and letting them rot, essentially.
Yeah.
So when you extrapolate out, like, yeah, sure. Like that's a sensible idea.
I like the section where James speaks to the public and basically goes up to normal folks walking up and down the streets of Washington and asks them their thoughts on the UFO topic. And in a very quick kind of section, we get a range of, yeah, it's definitely true, to no, it's not true, to it might be, but it's too scary to think about, so I don't want to know, and everything in between. And I think
What
that's
is
a really...
There's that one lady who says, hide your kids, hide your wives.
Yeah.
And they all kind of laugh. But yeah, I thought it was good too. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be mad if James included a little more of that, to be honest, because
No, I agree.
there are so many different ideas out there about this stuff, and some people on the internet kind of say, we're ready for this. You can just open
Some people
kimono
aren't.
disclosure. Some people just aren't. They're not. Like, we're seeing that with the drone incursions.
Some people don't want to be ready for it. That's it. It's like some people are, some people aren't. Some people don't want to be. Some people don't know they want to be. And everything in between. So it's really easy online to speak for everyone.
I'd say as well that some people that say they are ready for it, there's a difference in, yeah, I'm ready for UFOs to be here and to know there's life in the universe. There's a difference between that and having a 10-foot tall mantis being in front of you, if that's what they are. Like, most people would empty their bowels when, confronted with something like that, and they'd never be the same again. So I think, yeah, there's definitely something to be said about people's honesty and knowing what you do in certain situations.
So I would say there we have covered the first third of the documentary. The next part kicks off with a few kind of chapters or sections almost. So you've had a summary of what's going on, some big new players or big name players who aren't relatively outspoken on the topic, or you've heard their names mentioned. Now we move on to some whistleblowers. We get one who's kind of shot from behind. We see the back of the guy's head.
Hold on. Just before you go into this, there's one thing that happened just before this that I wanted to mention, and it's what Hal says. We touched on this before when the trailer came out in a breakdown episode, where Hal says, I would go to jail to say things that I know that I've been exposed to in the program. And that quote's a bit wider in the actual documentary.
Yes.
Hal is asked to comment on the Wilson documents, and he says that he doesn't feel he can comment on it. And he says, until there's a statement that bridges my NDAs, I would go to jail to say things that I know that I've been exposed to in the program. If Davis was to say that it happened, then I'd say it happened, which I think kind of it's essentially him saying, like, one, that he's worked on what sounds to be the legacy UFO program or on aspects of it. There's an argument to be made that maybe ORSAP could qualify because, you know, he would have NDAs there and it's private industry and so on and so forth. But also in a roundabout way there, he's essentially saying, well, I'm not going to say it before Davis says it, but if he says yes, then I'll say yes. you know?
Yeah.
He's almost confirming it right there on screen for us.
I also, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Sure. I'm on your same side of the fence here, Dan. I hear Hal Puthoff say that, and I'm like, he's confirming this. I believe the Wilson Davis memo and notes are a real, genuine meeting. It happened. Wilson said those things to Davis. I think Puthoff's dancing around not being able to confirm it because it's not his place to confirm it either.
Sure.
However, I get where folks who get frustrated with this topic look at that and go, oh, there's another talking head not just coming out and saying it. That is a frustration in the subject. I think you just have to be able to accept that and kind of look past it to probably enjoy the subject as well.
Yeah, definitely. He does go on to say that there is, and I think this is just at the beginning of the bit you were going to speak about. Hal says there is lots more data that has not gotten out that he saw, that he worked on, but he can't talk about it. So again, a frustrating I can't talk about it, but a tantalizing carrot dangling there, you know?
Yeah. So whistleblower section, Dan. US Navy X is a whistleblower who is currently going through the process to come out in the public and discuss things. James said that is still happening and he still believes US Navy X will come forward. And this whistleblower just said that they've seen craft perform anomalous maneuvers, characteristics, whistleblowery stuff. It's not revelatory because you don't know a lot of detail around them. But this is the kind of stuff that you would still expect to see in a documentary like this, and you would still rather have in than not have it in.
Yeah, absolutely. With US Navy X, I felt that he didn't really say anything that wasn't said before. He or she, I guess, the voices changed. But it reminded me of when we saw Alex Dietrich in Unidentified, and she was just, you know, a silhouette, and she hadn't come out yet. And then all these years later, now we know who she is, and she's there talking about her experience. And just the more of these people that come forward, even if what they say isn't super flashy, the better, because it's just a snowball that just keeps building.
Yeah, and then we do see some faces. We've got Lenville Logan, who you mentioned before, who supported the task force. Sarah Gam appears briefly as well. I've spoken to Sarah Gam, as have several others. She talks about seeing on various platforms we have objects that clearly defy physics. They are not balloons. They are not seagulls. They are not misidentifications. Again, I suppose she goes into more detail on those on platforms like this that she's been on since.
It was her reaction for me. So there's a very specific moment, and I wonder if you noticed this too.
I know the one
also,
you mean.
So James asked her, did what you see convince you that DoD and the IC have more compelling data than what the general public knows? And this is the first time that she's appeared in the documentary. You know, she's painted as a UFO whistleblower before she says this. And there's this long pause where she goes to say something and then she stops herself. And it comes across as if there's a real consideration there on her part of, I'm about to become a public UFO whistleblower.
Yeah.
And do I want to do this? It feels like a run-up, you know?
Yeah.
And when we look at these documentaries and we're like, is it for the UFO community or is it for Joe Public? That's one of those moments where I felt, you know what? If I didn't know who Sarah was, that moment, that really human pause, and you can see her struggling, and then the eventual yes that she gives, that would be really heavy. Like, how did you feel about that moment?
Yeah, again, I suppose I've got the view of it because I've spoken to her and I've heard her interviews already, longer form, with Ross Coulter, with Matt Ford, speaking to her personally. Less gravitas to it, but like you say, if I'm seeing her for the first time, I'm going, oh, she's really, and then you have to put yourself in those shoes. Like, she's probably saying this for the first time publicly at that point. A bit like when I watched The Shawshank Redemption for the first time. I had watched it years after it came out, so the big reveal at the end, where, spoilers, folks, the tunnels behind the poster and stuff, I had seen that before in other movies.
Oh,
But
sure.
this was the movie that kind of made that famous and built up to that and made it really kind of exceptional the way it was done. So I had to kind of appreciate that's why folks love this, because of that big reveal and the build
Yeah.
to it. So no,
Yeah.
that was good. And then we get Jason Sands. I'm glad we discussed about Jason Sands and his role and whatnot. He talks about working Nellis Air Force Base and everything. They track the object. We see the Nellis Air Force footage of the UAP kind of crazy dashing about the camera and whatnot. Difficult to make out what it is exactly. Looks a bit odd in shape. And then allegedly a few days later, Jason Sands and a few others encounter a downed craft in the desert. Dan, is that fair to say? With an entity
Yeah.
in it?
He didn't paint the story exactly. So he kind of said they were going downrange for something else.
Yeah.
And they spotted a guy who was just walking in the middle of nowhere. So they were driving over to him to just be like, "Mate, you're okay."
Yeah.
As we say in Britain, I guess they would just different language.
Yeah.
But upon getting there, they noticed that he had like whitish, bluish skin, and thought that it was a guy that was in trouble, had hypothermia. So they got out and went to him. At which point, one of Sands's colleagues in the car yelled that the guy had no ears. Jason describes the guy as having like bigger eyes and stuff like that. And at this point, they notice that there's this ship kind of that's landed that almost looks like two tusks with a little pod between the tusks.
Yeah.
Really peculiar looking thing, nothing that humans have ever made, for sure. And then that the guy speaks to him. I say the being speaks to Jason in a language that Jason doesn't understand, but even though he doesn't recognize the language and doesn't speak it, he does understand it kind of intuitively or telepathically. That's the word used. And that the being asks him for, what was it he asked him? For Tantilium or Trentilium, he says. To which Jason responds, do you mean titanium? And the guy says no. And then just off he goes back into his cockpit, and the thing rises up and leaves. I found that curious. I was like, well, if the craft isn't working, like, is he just low on petrol and this stuff is that craft's fuel source? Or is it that he's doing repairs and space mode is out but atmosphere mode is fine? What exactly is the kind of the material that he's looking for? But there were a few other details in there as well, like the fact that Jason mentions that the guy's boots were super shiny, and even just walking along the desert road, they should have been dusty, and he was just confused by the whole thing. A very, very John Keel encounter, I would say.
Have you read any Keel?
Never, actually.
Never. No. Okay, that's fine. Take a shot, folks. It's not a particularly common shaped craft, like you said, it's described, and that's a good way to put it. Like kind of two tusks either side of. In my head, it's almost a bit like that. So let's use the two tusks with the cockpit of a small one-man helicopter, almost like bubble dome on the front. Jetsony type object. I don't know.
Jetsony. Yeah, that's fair.
It's a very strange encounter, and he's also allegedly. I say allegedly. I don't think that's fair because he says he has, and others have vetted him to say he has.
I'm going to hold it up to the camera.
Yeah, for folks on YouTube, you'll see that kind of description, like a walrus tusks. Imagine a walrus face, with the face lifted up in the middle.
And then this was Jason's picture of, again, on YouTube, if you're watching, that was Jason's picture of the guy that he encountered.
Walrus people confirmed. There we go.
Have you ever seen Tusk, the movie?
Maybe back in the day.
Oh, I don't think it's that old.
Is it
Just
not? Then
about.
no.
No, don't watch it. It's horrifically depressing. It's really good, but it's just depressing. Just about a
Okay.
guy that gets turned into a walrus by a crazy mad scientist.
Could very well be what happened here. Um, but I'm personally glad, Dan, that he left in the Jason Sands stuff, because I think it's up to the individual to make up their own mind if they believe that, if it's too much for them, if it's not. So, and like I say, I'll add in here, if you've not listened to my interview with James Fox yet, I asked James about things he knows that he hasn't been able to say or can't say. And James said, yeah, there's stuff that may be scary, and it's nothing we've not heard before from other folks. I asked him if the stuff he knows he can't tell us influences his work. He had a big pause, like Sirigam. He then says, yeah, probably indirectly. I then asked him, what specifically in your work do you think is influenced? He mentions in this, leaving in the Jason Sands story is an aspect of the work influenced by things he knows that he can't tell us. So at least there's something from that. I'd rather make up my own mind. In the same breath, if Jeremy Corbell or George Knapp or Ross Coulter or anyone gets a hold of a video or picture, I'd rather it's released for us to see and for very quickly the community or others to debunk it, push it out the way, or embrace it and be like, that's something interesting. For example, that jellyfish UAP, likely human tech in some way, shape, or form. Incredibly strange looking human tech, though. If indeed that's what it is, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree
I'd
with
rather
that
make
though.
up my own mind.
And we're eventually, whether it's a drip feed or a psyop or a rollout, whatever way you want to look at it, we're eventually going to get a picture of an alien. Like, I'm not talking like next year. It could be like in 100 years, whatever. But eventually we'll get to the place where we meet an alien and we'll see what they look like. And it's going to be weird. It's going to be challenging. So when you listen to Jason Sands' testimony in this, like, yeah, okay, part of you is going to want to just roll your eyes and kind of be like, oh, yeah, just a being, and call it silly. But then, I challenge people, be aware of your bias, be aware of where your red line is, and realize that the moment that we face something like this is going to be challenging and it's going to be weird. Like we always say this about UFO videos, don't we? That eventually when we do see a real deal UFO video, it's going to look odd. We're not going to be able to say that's CGI because we don't know how they move.
Yeah.
It might move in a way that looks like CGI and there's no air resistance and so on and so forth. So yeah, we have to hold these things lightly and take them seriously.
Let's try and get through the next couple of sections in a reasonable amount of time. Stealing the truth. We get the Gary McKinnon story. Gary McKinnon is a hacker who famously a couple of decades ago, back when it was 56K dial-up, Dan, as he reminds us, hacked the NASA databases. And I always think about when we talked about, Jurassic Park hacking, access program grade, access main program grade. And it's like the password is like password and stuff like that. It's like open gates / and it's like they open, right? So he was a genuine hacker back in the day. And essentially the big part of his story was he found one evidence of a list of non-terrestrial officers, alien entities based on Earth or otherwise, and also an image he got 2/3 of downloaded. It took 5 minutes to download 1 megabit back in the day, folks. Some of the younger listeners may not believe that, but it did. He got 2/3 of a picture which showed a planet he believes was Earth, potentially, with a huge craft in the foreground, taken by satellite, and then it cuts off and he's basically found out and they disconnect his connection. That's the Gary McKinnon story. The US tried to extradite him out to the US from the UK. It didn't happen. Quick take on this. I think it's a great get for James to get Gary McKinnon on because he doesn't do or say very much publicly.
No, he doesn't. And this has had a very real impact on his life. He can't leave the UK pretty much. He can live here and that's it. Otherwise, he'll be extradited or captured by the US or whatever. That was the deal. And so it's this story that's just been around. He's never embellished it. It's been very consistent. I like the way in this Gary kind of describes seeing the planet. He says Earth, and then he catches himself, and then he says so it was a planet where you could see atmosphere and an ocean.
Yeah, like Earth.
Um,
Yeah.
like Earth. So it might not have even been Earth. It could have been imagery from Jupiter or whatever. Not that Jupiter has oceans.
Yeah,
But
bad pick there, Dan, of all the
Yeah.
planets.
Oh, let's go Neptune.
Yeah. Could have been Mars. Oh wait, no. Yeah.
So yeah, it could be another planet. But the craft, it's this cigar-shaped thing with these bubbles kind of at the middle of it. And it really reminds me of, can you remember the image that To the Stars Pour Out of the craft that they were gonna make?
Yeah. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of that. And so you're just kind of left in a place kind of going, maybe not. Like maybe it could have been a honeypot or something, because the computer, it didn't have a password on it. Gary was just kind of screen sharing, but back in the day that was difficult to do. You didn't have the apps to do that, where you could just click one button like now. So yeah, it's a really intriguing one, and another one that we'll probably never know, but it would be really nice to one day kind of see an image and go, oh hey, is that the one Gary saw?
Yes, absolutely. The Calvin photo is up here as well, Dan. We get
Yes.
James Fox, boots on the ground, David Clark, and they are talking to Craig Lindsay, who was the press officer who had one of the 6 alleged prints that were made of the photograph. We've talked about Calvin quite a few times, but we've got some new information here that the 2 witnesses may still be out there. That they got a chef who makes me sound English. He's so Scottish.
Dude, I thought maybe he was a little tipsy. I guess
no, that's just
no, it's just that area.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think he was anyway. I know folk that talk like that, or I know people who talk like that. I should say before I get too Scottish. So yeah, they had him basically saying that they were chefs and that they were spooked by kind of Men in Black type folks, and yeah, that they just took off a few weeks later. Kind of things went kind of downhill for them. They were panicked and whatnot. General thoughts on Calvin at this point?
It's a story, I continue to talk to like people that are involved in the investigation who found that photo, and it was really cool to see David Clark and his team in this documentary and being giving the credit they deserve for finding it. Really awesome as well that Craig Lindsay kept that photo. It just goes to show the human errors or human angle in the whole thing. You can have secrecy up the wazoo, but all it takes is one person being curious enough in the chain of command to go, I'm going to hold on to this for 30 years later for that photo to come out. And the MOD still hasn't commented on it. I was surprised to see the guy, the new guy. Sorry, what was his name?
Which one?
The thick Scottish accent dude.
Oh, I never wrote down his name because he was so Scottish.
I could have sworn I wrote his name down. Okay. I can't find it right now anyway. But yeah, I was surprised to see that in there, because there are supposedly a number of people outside having their break when these Men in Black show up to kind of confront the 2 witnesses and say, breaks over, go inside. But that story would be a lot more compelling for me if there were other witnesses willing to corroborate that happened. And thus far, there isn't. And so it's just something, again, you kind of have to go, okay, sure. Because it is weird that those witnesses haven't come out and they're so difficult to find. One of the witnesses, he says his name in this. I can confirm the name he said is one of the witnesses' names. And yeah, but they're gone. They want nothing to do with it. So where are they? The guy at one point suggests, Richard Greaves, his name is, sorry. He says they might be dead. I just want to know. And I hope that's not the case. I hope nothing came back on them off this, whether it was a US Black project or a UFO or what. But it's a possibility, right? Because we just don't know. And if they're not talking about it, something spooked them. So the story makes sense. It would just be cool if we could get more corroborating witnesses. And I love that James included in this section a kind of a plea for more information.
Yeah.
If you know anything, please get in touch with David Clark. Yeah, I reiterate that. This is an ongoing story. and it took 30 years to even get where we are now. And the leads are out there. So yeah, please get in touch with David Clark if you know more.
Yep. They have some stuff in here on the NASA conference in 2023, Dan, with the report, the independent study findings, and Bill Nelson's conference. I don't have a whole lot to say on it. Kind of covered that with James as well. Bill Nelson flip-flops a little bit on the UAP topic and doesn't speak particularly well the last few times he has, because he kind of conflates what Grush said. And I think James shows that really well, that Bill Nelson was quite dismissive of David Grush and his comments at the hearing, that one, he hadn't really watched, but two, he's a bit childish about what David Grush, how he puts across what Grush said, which I thought was quite poor, but maybe by design, maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah, this section for me I felt it was a little bit messy, if I'm honest. I could see what James was trying to do, but when this news came out about the NASA study team and stuff like that, NASA emphasized that they weren't going to be studying the UAP phenomena, or UAP, I should say, not unidentified anomalous phenomena. And they were just kind of looking at how they would go about a study in the future if they were to do it. And so the way that the media kind of presented that NASA had found no evidence of extraterrestrial life was kind of a misnomer, because they hadn't looked for those things. They were looking for sensors and things that they could use to do that study. So I felt like this was a little messy in the shortcut taken to kind of paint the general correct picture of what went down wasn't quite accurate, if that makes sense. Just in that sense of study, and they weren't studying it.
Yeah. And if that's the middle third of the documentary, the last third goes back and forward, picking out pieces of the documentary. We get more on Jason Sands. We get the story that we've discussed already. He mentions that the technology could or potentially should be classified, but there's no reason that they shouldn't let people know there is other life out there, which as a statement is completely fair to say, you know what, maybe this technology should be classified for whatever reason. Some folks won't like that, but they should be telling us there's other life. I imagine you don't disagree with that, Dan.
No, not at all. And it's a really great example of something that we've definitely touched on before, about all the people coming out that are talking about this from government. They're not saying they want open kimono disclosure to show us everything, to show us, the other beings' anatomy and stuff like that. They're just saying they want the knowledge that we're not alone out there, so that science can start doing the thing, and that humanity can kind of acclimate to the fact. Just that knowledge alone would change the world. Fundamentally, in some ways, many things would be the same, but it would affect a lot. And so, yeah, I think it's just worth remembering that the current push for disclosure isn't for everything to be on the table.
Cool. This last kind of third end, Dan, I've got notes of kind of Mace asking Grush if he believes the government has made contact with ET. He can't discuss that in a public setting, kind of saying something without saying something. I've got comments on the Sands story again, Schumer Rounds amendment, and then I'll get to Putov. What have you got in that kind of last half hour that kind of stands out to you?
So there's a segment with Hal talking about a meeting that a bunch of them had, or a bunch of people had, where they were talking about disclosure and whether it should happen. And he said that basically lots will backfire, like companies having advantages over other companies because they were given, XYZ, and that would lead to lawsuits against the government, and you'd be opening a can of worms. And then he says, we came to the conclusion disclosure is unsustainable across various issues, and then says a lot has to happen before that can take place. I thought that was interesting. Would love to be a fly on the wall in that meeting to see who was there. I think through other means we've had it confirmed that Bigelow was there, maybe. But this sounds like a whole bunch of people. I want to know who was there. I hope someone's chasing down the leads.
So that was an hour and 28 minutes in. So are your notes pretty similar to mine then, that it's quite clippy up until that point where you've got Mace talking to Grush, the Sands story, it goes over the UAP Disclosure Act, the Schumer Rounds amendment, and then it kind of starts to wrap up. we've discussed that idea, like you say before, Dan, about companies and how real world disclosure would work. And it is simple things, even like how would insurance cover alien life? Companies suing each other because company X has alien technology given to them by the government to back engineer. Companies Y and Z weren't given that. Company X is now worth $1 trillion more. Company Y and Z have been, there's been illegal activity going on that they have not been given this kind of stuff, and that's all genuine real world stuff. People might go, it doesn't matter, but it would, because that's something that would have a tangible impact immediately, let
Yeah.
alone paradigm shifts and people's psyches and
It'll
everything else
matter
like
to the
that.
shareholders, and when they want their
100%.
profit maximized and they
Yeah.
were given an unfair disadvantage by the government, like
Yeah.
there'll be lawsuits. Sure,
Yeah.
they're boring. Not everyone will watch them. It's not going to be the trial of the century, but this is the kind of stuff that is being thought about when whoever the secret keepers are thinking whether they should just open the floodgates and let us all know.
I love the shot of Lockheed Martin. I discussed this with James, with the moon in the top right hand corner.
Yes.
Very telling. Lovely shot. We are very aware that they are more than likely people who have pieces, if not full intact craft, of non-human origin and potentially organic material, bodies. Don't know what they have, but they've got stuff. We know that much, don't they? And just having that shot of the moon kind of right in the top corner of the screen, I loved. I thought that was really nice. Some excellent storytelling there. If a picture could speak, Dan, I think is what I want to say.
Yeah, it came at a really good time. And there's a little clip around here with Brian Bender where he's kind of talking about what it means if this is all true. That, there are a group of people in the government who make decisions for everyone, not just America, but that have effects on everyone on Earth. They've made decisions about this issue without informing anyone, taking it upon themselves. And he says that's a government within a government. How does a democracy survive that? And I think that's a very true, very fair question. It almost paints the picture of they almost would want to pretend that the discovery was happening now, just so that they didn't have to deal with any of this shit. You know?
Yeah. And we've discussed that idea, haven't we? That it's easier to plead ignorance and go along with the, oh, we found something on a different planet. Oh, wait. Or, God, let's use a real world scenario. Oh, these drones are buzzing about all these facilities. Oh, actually, some of them aren't drones. Some of them are genuine non-human craft. And maybe that's how that plays out. Maybe not. Who knows? But they can then plead ignorance, can't they? And be like, oh, we've just discovered this along with you. We had a little bit of knowledge, but not too much. And I don't think the general public at large would ask questions back the way. I think the UFO community might want answers. And where did you hide the Roswell wreckage? General public wouldn't care. They want to know how this new reality of alien life and something visiting here is going to affect them tomorrow. How is it going to affect people's stocks and shares? Like we talked about, insurance policies. Does the price of milk go up? Is that going to affect you? Not the idea that we're going to have some kind of South African style Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's not going to be forefront in your average person's mind.
No.
And neither
I
it should
completely
be.
agree with you.
You've got to
when
kind
the
of
history books, like, say disclosure happened, it's just going to say, this is where we found. We are not alone. It's not going to have, Stephen Greenstreet was fighting with so-and-so on Twitter. Like, it's just not. Like, it's not the way it's going to go.
Dan, I would encourage folks to watch the credits, because there's still little clips throughout the credits as well. I think James really gives people their money worth in that sense. Is there anything from the end you want to talk about before we wrap up with our final thoughts?
So the ending itself, like the very last scene of the film, where Dr. Gary Nolan is asked by James Fox, if we were provided clearances right here, right now, could you walk me into a lab and show me something? And Gary kind of tenses up and just says, I'm not saying anything. And that's kind of, it's played as a mic drop ending. Like there's a lot implied there, right? That Gary might have knowledge. Gary's actually spoken to this on Twitter because that little clip was in the trailer. And Gary said, I insinuate nothing. I said I would not answer because there's no answer. If I had anything that would help the committees that they don't already know through other sources, you can be assured I don't need to be subpoenaed to let them know about it. That doesn't mean one should talk about it publicly. Anyone with any ability to read body language should be able to see by the look on my face that I was pained by the question. I didn't choose for that as part of a lengthy interview to be the ending of a documentary. That said, James is a good friend. I approve the part of the movie I am in, thought the ending for me was awkward, but understood what James was trying to do by putting it there, though I never expected that would even end up in the movie. I am accustomed to, as a scientist, to being able to talk openly but carefully. I don't have at the ready 100 different ways to avoid questions or nuance with perfect elegance. Given the many ways that question could be interpreted by me when played against how others might might interpret my answer, few answers would have satisfied everyone. Which, totally fair enough. But on the other hand, that's what someone with inside information would say.
Yeah. Gary is a very intelligent man.
He is.
Very intelligent. Yeah. So ultimately, Dan, your thoughts on the program?
So for me, it kind of hit my expectations that I explained at the beginning. I asked you a question the other day. I'm going to give my answer to it now, but then you can give it. I asked Andy if this was better than the phenomenon for him. For me, I would say it wasn't. The storytelling at times I felt was a little bit muddled. I wasn't a fan of the AI pictures that were used. I really missed those kind of super classy CGI reproductions of UFO sightings that they had in the phenomena. I thought they were so well done. But yeah, I guess ultimately not as good as the phenomenon, but still incredibly important part of the story. And I think if you're outside of this subject day to day, I think it'll kind of hit the mark for you in a way that it won't for the community. But yeah, I think I would probably give it like a out of 10. I would say like a 6.5, which feels harsh, or a 7. Probably, like, as we've had this conversation, I've come around a bit, so I'd probably settle on a 7 out of 10.
Okay, cool. So yeah, genuinely, like Dan says, I never gave him an answer, just so I could think about it. I would say, for me personally, I've not watched the phenomenon for over a year, but I enjoyed this as much because I like it digging down into a niche within the UFO topic. If the phenomenon's more broad brushstrokes on the UAP topic and an introduction to it, I think this is like the follow-on. I mean, can you prefer Empire Strikes Back if you've never seen A New Hope?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Like, it's not quite so black and white. Like, you have to have had that for that to happen, for this one to happen.
Yeah, so for me, it's like, okay, I want to see the next one. Because I enjoyed the first one so much. I enjoyed the angle it went. I would have probably liked to have seen some more detail in some other cases to dive into those, but then is it just James telling stories about cases? Because how would that work necessarily without witnesses and all that kind of stuff? I don't know if that would fit in what he was doing, but I think what he's trying to do is capture the balance between a new audience, because you're going to have to put in about the hearings and all that kind of stuff, and introducing stuff that he has uncovered or is working on that he does with like McConnell, Putov, the whistleblowers coming forward. If Sands hadn't come forward, that would have been another new whistleblower in this documentary who wouldn't have been. And I'm sure that was the original plan, was Sands not to come out and say anything until this was out. So for me, I'd go at least 8.5 out of 10 in terms of UFO documentaries, because if you're going with the phenomenon being the best one, I take it.
Yeah, I mean,
so
no one does it like
saying,
James, right?
Are you saying that's a 10 though?
I would give that
Or
a 9.
Okay.
A 9,
right.
yeah.
Then I would say this for me is like an 8.5. There's stuff I would have liked to have seen, but I think it does the job for everyone who's going to watch it to really enjoy and get something from it. I wonder if he would have wanted some more whistleblowers. If Grush had been in it, that may have taken it up a notch, but Grush clearly isn't coming forward publicly still. Yeah, I really liked it. And I'm not just saying that. You know, I'd quite happily say that it was a 7 or a 6 or whatever. I would say
Oh yeah,
8,
for sure.
8.5, with the phenomenon being like a 9, 9.5.
Sure.
And that's what I'm saying. I liked it probably more because it started to dig into a niche and started to get to questions like tracking these things going back and forward. And it's the next level down of, okay, we'll give you an introduction in the phenomenon. Here's an aspect of this which is real smoking gun material, but it's such a hard aspect to get incredible levels of detail on without going into pure speculation territory. Does that waffle make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Like it's the same with all these things, right? It's difficult to get to a place where you're concluding. And so it's not like just a normal movie where it's like you get an ending. They're all open-ended.
Yeah.
And I think that leaves a kind of dissatisfied kind of ending to any of these things.
I'll
But
tell
that's
you.
just par for the course.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I think makes these difficult, and I broached this with James. Trying to make a documentary like this, where in the last year and a half, he's been making it for 18 months, I think, at least. There are so many moving parts constantly. So
Mhm.
you're making a documentary, and then as you go along, you're having to either take stuff out or change a narrative, or you could have person A who is going to play a part in it, a big part, blow up in a bad way, and you have to reduce that part, or the hearings go badly, or we find out something else, and all of a sudden that big thing becomes a small thing, or a small thing becomes a big thing. So you're working with like a bit of like a kind of live organism here as it goes along, and it's like, at what point do you press the button and just go? Because I imagine you could
Yeah.
constantly go, I'll wait a couple of months, because I suppose a nice way to kind of finish up. There's a lot of chat that Dan, the next couple of weeks or month or so, there's going to be some big news or stuff happening, probably. So does James wait on that coming out and then tack that on the end? Does he wait and see the first 60 days of the Trump administration and see how that goes? And you could probably end with Trump coming in and the new folks being appointed in positions of power. Who gets to be the head of the FBI? Who gets to be the head of the national, intelligence committees? Whatever that kind of stuff would work out as. And that would be a nice way to end it. But at what point do you stop? So, yeah, I really liked it. And I don't think anyone who buys it and pre-orders it will be disappointed. But you can also wait a couple of, I think he said 2 weeks from release. So about the 1st of January, you can rent it and pay less, which James said himself. So if folks
Sure.
don't want to, I mean, am I going to watch my copy again? I don't know. Maybe for something down the line research wise. But I've bought it and pre-ordered it and paid the full amount because I'm like, do you know what? Thanks, James. I appreciate the work you've put in. And it's out there for folks to watch. So yeah, I enjoyed it, and I look forward to what James is working on next.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be interesting seeing where he goes with this, like you said, with the Trump administration stuff and everything that's kind of said to be in the works. I'm sure his camera is always running, and he's always kind of thinking, "What documentary is going to make? What can this be in the
Well,
next one?"
he's back out in Brazil in a few weeks to chase up the Virginia stuff. So he's confident of some leads out there. 14 to 15 people from around 200 leads he thinks might be able to point him in the direction of the video with the alien body on it. But we shall see. But don't we love this topic? So yeah, if nothing else, folks, it's a wonderful way, I think, to end the year with this documentary. And I don't think we'll have to wait too long for some more news to come out. But in the meantime, Dan, there are drones or objects or UFOs flying over people's heads from a source that is currently unknown, it seems. So yeah.
Yeah. So
But
don't wait. Go bag yourself one. If you're in the
Yeah.
US, go to New Jersey, have a look, see what's there. And for
We
God's
will,
sake, take some binoculars.
Yeah, we will leave that till we record the kind of end of year breakdown next week or something like that.
Sure.
And for the love of God, hopefully by then it's resolved itself a little bit more, because it's been going on a while now, hasn't it? But yeah,
it's boring. Like, do something or stop.
yeah, or catch them, or catch one.
Or catch them.
Yeah. So honestly, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, folks. Go and pre-order your copy of the Phenomenon, the program. You don't pre-order the Phenomenon, yeah. So go get the program. By the time you listen to this, it's out already. If you really want to support James and get involved and watch that, it'll be worth your time, I promise you. If you don't and you want to wait and see, then it'll be available to rent come about the 1st of January. And yeah, I would love to know people's thoughts on it. Send them in. So yeah, cheers, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Speak to you all very soon, folks. That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify. Just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and